Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, 12th edition, Chapter 1, Study Guide. Anatomy is the science of body structures and the relationship among structures. Physiology is the science of body functions. Dissection is the careful cutting apart of body structures to study their relationship. Some subspecialties of anatomy are embryology, developmental biology, histology, surface anatomy, gross anatomy, systemic anatomy, regional anatomy, radiographic anatomy, and pathophysiological anatomy. Let me correct that to pathological anatomy. Some specialties of physiology are neurophysiology, endocrinology, cardiovascular physiology, immunology, respiratory physiology, renal physiology, exercise physiology, pathophysiology. Levels of structural organization. The human body consists of 6 levels of structural organization: chemical, cellular, tissue, organ, system, and organismal. Cells are the basic structural and functional living units of an organism and the smallest living units in the human body. Tissues are groups of cells and the material surrounding them that work together to perform a particular function. Organs are composed of 2 or more different types of tissues. They have specific functions and usually have recognizable shapes. Systems consist of related organs that have a common function. An organism is any living individual. The 11 systems of the human body are the organism: integumentary, skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems. Characteristics of the living human organism. All organisms carry on certain processes that distinguish them from non-living things. The most important life processes of the human body are metabolism, responsiveness, movement, growth, differentiation, and reproduction. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium in the human body's internal environment produced by the interplay of all the body's regulatory processes. Body fluids are dilute, watery solutions, intracellular fluid inside cells, and extracellular fluid outside the cells. Interstitial fluid is the ECF that fills the spaces between tissue cells. Plasma is the ECF within blood vessels. ICF stands for intracellular fluid, ECF extracellular fluid. Because it surrounds all body cells, interstitial fluid is called the body's internal environment. Disruptions of homeostasis come from external and internal stimuli and psychological stresses. When disruption of homeostasis is mild and temporary, responses of body cells quickly restore balance in the internal environment. If disruption is extreme, regulation of homeostasis may fail. Most often, the nervous system and endocrine system, acting together or separately, regulate homeostasis. The nervous system detects body changes and sends nerve impulses to counteract changes in controlled conditions. The endocrine system regulates homeostasis by secreting hormones. Feedback systems include 3 components. Receptors monitor changes in a controlled condition and send input to a control center. The control center sends the value at which a controlled condition should be maintained, evaluates the input it receives from receptors, and generates output commands when they are needed. Effectors receive output from control centers and produce a response that alters the controlled condition. If a response reverses the original stimulus, the system is operating by negative feedback. If a response enhances the original stimulus, the system is operating by positive feedback. One example of negative feedback is the regulation of blood pressure. If a stimulus causes blood pressure to rise, blood pressure being a controlled condition, baroreceptors, pressure-sensitive nerve cells, the receptors in blood vessels send impulses to the brain, the control center. The brain sends impulses to the heart, the effector. As a result, the heart rate decreases, which is the response, and blood pressure decreases to normal, restoration of homeostasis. So in parentheses I have here the various names of a feedback system, and that would be controlled condition, pressure sensitive nerve centers, which are the receptors. Let me read the whole thing again. One example of a negative feedback system is the regulation of blood pressure. If a stimulus causes blood pressure, which is the controlled condition, to rise, baroreceptors, which are pressure-sensitive nerve cells, they are the receptors, in blood vessels send impulses, which is the input, to the brain, which is the control center. The brain sends impulses, that is the output, to the heart, which is the effector. As a result, the heart rate decreases, that's the response, and the blood pressure, which was the controlled condition, decreases to normal, and homeostasis is resumed. Now I'm going to read that without the parentheses one more time. One example of negative feedback is the regulation of blood pressure. If a stimulus causes blood pressure to rise, baroreceptors in blood vessels send impulses to the brain. The brain sends impulses to the heart. As a result, the heart rate decreases and blood pressure decreases to normal. One example of positive feedback occurs during birth of a baby. When labor begins, the cervix of the uterus is stretched, and the stretch-sensitive nerve cells in the cervix send nerve impulses to the brain. The brain responds by releasing oxytocin, which stimulates the uterus to contract more forcefully. Movement of the fetus further stretches the cervix, more oxytocin is released, and even more forceful contractions occur. The cycle is broken when the baby is born. Now with the parentheses. One example of positive feedback occurs during the birth of a baby. When labor begins, the cervix of the uterus is stretched. Stimulus. The stretch-sensitive nerve cells in the cervix, receptors, send nerve impulses, input, to the brain, the control center. The brain responds by releasing oxytocin, the output, which stimulates the uterus, the effector, to contract more forcefully, the response. Movement of the fetus further stretches the cervix, more oxytocin is released, and even more forceful contractions occur. The cycle is broken with the birth of the baby. Now without the parentheses. One example of positive feedback occurs during the birth of a baby. When labor begins, the cervix of the uterus is stretched, and the stretch-sensitive nerve cells in the cervix send nerve impulses to the brain. The brain responds by releasing oxytocin, which stimulates the uterus to contract more forcefully. Movement of the fetus further stretches the cervix, more oxytocin is released, and even more forceful contractions occur. The cycle is broken with the birth of the baby. Disruptions of homeostatic imbalance can lead to disorders, disease, and even death. A disorder is a general term for any abnormality of structure or function. A disease is an illness with a definite set of signs and symptoms. Symptoms are subjective changes in body functions that are not apparent to an observer. Signs are objective changes that can be observed and measured. Basic anatomical terminology. Descriptions of any region of the body assume the body is in the anatomical position, in which the subject stands erect facing the observer, with the head level and the eyes facing directly forward. The feet are flat on the floor and directed forward, and the upper limbs are at the sides with the palms turned forward. A body lying down is prone. Repeat. Incorrect. A body lying face down is prone. A body lying face up is supine. Regional names are terms given to specific regions of the body. The principal regions are the head, neck, trunk, upper limbs, and lower limbs. Within the region, specific body parts have common names and are specified by corresponding anatomical terms. Examples are chest, thoracic, nose, nasal, wrist, carpal. Directional terms indicate the relationship of one part of the body to another. Planes are imaginary flat surfaces that are used to divide the body or organ to visualize interior structures. A mid-sagittal plane divides the body or an organ into equal right and left sides. A parasagittal plane divides the body of an organ into unequal right and left sides. A frontal plane divides the body of an organ into anterior and posterior portions. A transverse plane divides the body or an organ into superior and inferior portions. An oblique plane passes through the body or an organ at an angle between a transverse plane and either a mid-sagittal, parasagittal, or frontal plane. Sections are cut of the body or its organs made along a plane. They are named according to the plane along which the cut is made and include transverse, frontal, and sagittal sections. Body cavities are spaced in the body that help protect, separate, and support internal organs. Repeat. Body cavities are spaces in the body that help to protect, separate, and support internal organs. The cranial cavity contains the brain, and the vertebral canal contains the spinal cord. The meninges are protective tissues that line the cranial cavity and vertebral canal. The diaphragm separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. The viscera are organs within the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. A serous membrane lines the wall of the cavity and adheres to the viscera. The thoracic cavity is subdivided into 3 small cavities: pericardial cavity, which contains the heart, and 2 pleural cavities, each of which contain a lung. The central part of the thoracic cavity is an anatomical region called the mediastinum. The central part of the thoracic cavity is an anatomical region called the mediastinum. It is located near the pleural cavities, extending from the sternum to the vertebral column and from the first rib to the diaphragm. It contains all thoracic viscera except the lungs. The abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into superior abdominal and inferior pelvic cavities. Viscera of the abdominal cavity include the stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, and most of the large intestines. Viscera of the pelvic cavity include the urinary bladder, portions of the large intestines, and internal organs of the reproductive system. Serous membranes line the wall of the thoracic and abdominal cavities and cover the organs within them. They include the pleural, associated with the lungs, the pericardium, associated with the heart, and the peritoneum, associated with the abdominal cavity. To describe locations of organs more easily, the abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into 9 regions: right hypochondriac, epigastric, left hypochondriac, right lumbar, umbilical, left lumbar, right inguinal, hypogastric, and left inguinal. To locate the site of an abdominal pelvic abnormality in clinical studies, the abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into quadrants: right upper quadrant, RUQ, left upper quadrant, LUQ, right lower quadrant, RLQ, and left lower quadrant. Medical imaging. Medical imaging refers to techniques and procedures used to visualize images of the human body. They allow visualization of internal structures to diagnose abnormal anatomy and deviations from normal physiology. That completes the summary for Chapter 1, Study Guide.